Shalom, shalom. Dear friends, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us again on your channel, our Able Code channel, where we are studying the weekly Torah portion, the Law of Moses, in its annual cycle. We now have the Parashahs Bereshit and Noah in our video playlist on our YouTube channel for you to watch, if you haven't already, so you can get to today's Parashah with the background information. Today we have a very important Parashah because it deals with the father of faith, a man who in the Bible was recognized as a friend of God, a patriarch, a prophet, and a facet of his life that perhaps few know about. But by understanding it, you will understand many more things about his life according to the biblical data that has come down to us. This facet is that of Abraham as a liberator of slaves. This is Abel Flores, and without further ado, let us begin. Now we will embark on a comprehensive study with a textual and midrashic focus of the life and work of Abraham the patriarch, articulated around our central hypothesis: Abraham, liberator of slaves, first in the literal sense, liberation of captives, and then in the spiritual sense, liberation from idolatry through the teaching of monotheism. I carefully distinguish between Peshet, a plain reading of the biblical text, Midrash, a rabbinic interpretative expansion, and Hellenistic Jewish traditions, based on the Judeo-Roman historian Flavius Josephus. Now, what if I told you that the patriarch of three monotheistic religions wasn't a priest, nor a king, nor a mystical sage retired on a mountaintop, but an armed liberator, but also an ethical activist with a vocation to shape souls, and a fierce negotiator who said no to the spoils of war, but yes to justice? No, it's not a reinterpretation of the Bible. It's the Abraham of the Tanakh, read without embellishment, without added doctrines, without sanctimony. The Abraham of plain reading. The Abraham of flesh, blood, and sword. The one who receives a call not to pray, but to command his children and his household to keep the way of the Lord, practicing justice and righteousness in Hebrew. Tzedakah umishpah, two words that, as you'll see, are more dangerous to the wicked in biblical times than they seem today. Before continuing, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those who seek to understand the world through a different lens. Thank you for being part of this community that doesn't settle for the superficial, the Codigo Able community, with special thanks to the speaker. So, from the beginning, Abraham is not a passive believer. He doesn't wait for signs. He moves. He leaves his land of comfort. This is what today's parasha means in Hebrew, Lech Lecha, go for yourself, that is, save yourself, improve, not because he was offered a heavenly retirement plan, but because he carries a concrete ethical mission, to teach the path of justice and righteousness. Does this sound abstract to you? Wait, the Tanakh doesn't leave it up in the air. It gives it flesh, context, and conflict. In the first scene, radical hospitality. Three strangers, who some interpreters call angels, appear, and Abraham runs, literally runs, to attend to them. He washes their feet, offers them bread, meat, and shade. In a desert where life depends on hospitality, he doesn't ask for credentials. It doesn't matter if they are angels or enemies, which in those days was the most likely outcome. Three men together in a desert? Most likely they were bandits. But he welcomes them, cares for them, and listens to them. Not out of courtesy, but out of ethical and moral principles to love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you were the one thirsty in the desert, wouldn't you do that for yourself? Abraham is the biblical character who teaches about love and about the two most important commandments in the entire Torah, to believe in one almighty God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Second scene, Sodom. And this is where it all gets awkward. Because while others rage from the comfort of the altar, Abraham argues with God. Yes, he argues. He confronts him. He says, "Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Will not the judge of all the earth do justice?" He is not a pious and obedient man. He is an advocate for the innocent, a fierce intercessor, and not out of blind faith, but out of lucid ethics. Obviously, this argument with God has a pedagogical purpose. But wait, the film takes an even stranger turn. In Genesis 14, Abraham is shown leading a military operation. Yes, the man who hosts and prays also goes to war. He gathers 318 men born in his household, note that, not mercenaries or slaves, but born in his household, and sets out to rescue his nephew Lot and the captives who were carried off by a coalition of invading kings. And what does he do after winning? He refuses all the loot. Everything. He tells the king of Sodom, "I will not take a thread or a sandal strap, lest you say, I have made Abraham rich." So who is this guy? An armed mystic? A liberator without ambitions? A spiritual father who also masterminds war strategies? Well, if you're still hoping for a simple, domesticated figure fit for stained glass windows, you'd better change the channel. Because Abraham is anything but comfortable. And this is the real Abraham, the historical Abraham. Just as in academia, they talk about a historical Jesus, today we're talking about a historical Abraham. And if you still doubt that their impact went beyond their family, look at that strange phrase in Genesis 12 verse 5. It says that Abraham and Sarah left Haran with the souls they had made. Souls they made? What does that mean? A baby factory? A spiritual army? A community of converts? The most basic reading suggests they were acquired servants. But rabbinic tradition goes further. They were people Abraham and Sarah had discipled. Yes, discipleship before the term existed. People transformed, taught, formed, not by religious marketing, but by a way of life that challenged the structures of the ancient world, believing in one almighty God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Hospitality, justice, law, defense of the innocent, the formation of souls, and the liberation of captives. Does this sound like an impossible combination? It is, if we measure it by today's standards, those where spirituality is confused with neutrality and ethics, with good intentions without consequences. But Abraham wasn't neutral. He wasn't lukewarm. He wasn't politically correct. And yet, he wasn't a fanatic either. He didn't seek power, land, or trophies. He sought something much more dangerous, to embody an ethic that broke with the gods of violence, plunder, and indifference. And that, my friend, is revolutionary. Abraham was a revolutionary, but one of love for his neighbor, and armed to the teeth against the slave-owning kings of his generation. And you know what's even more disturbing? That the biblical account makes no effort to present him as perfect. Abraham also doubts. He also makes mistakes. He also negotiates with God. He is not an immaculate saint. He is a human being in constant struggle between his calling and his limits. Like you, like me, like all of us who understand that living justly is difficult. And sometimes it hurts. So, what do we do with Abraham today? Do we canonize him and leave him on a dusty altar? Or do we dare to look him in the face with all his contradictions and ask ourselves if we are willing to practice his kind of faith? The kind that is not measured in prayers, but in concrete actions. The kind that doesn't hide in temples, synagogues, or churches, but reaches out to the stranger, the captive, the threatened innocent. Perhaps we can't muster 318 men to rescue anyone. But we can and must question, intercede, educate, and act. Like Abraham, without loot, without glory, but with justice and right. Now, how do you build a collective identity when your story begins with a man who left everything behind, without a map, without an army, without a clear promise, and walked into the unknown? A man who wasn't looking for a land, but for meaning? That is, a land that would give meaning to justice. That's what the promised land is all about, making that land a jurisdiction, a country, a kingdom, a place where justice reigns. What if that man, who is Abraham, didn't found an empire, a city, or even an organized religion, but a radical way of living ethics? That man is the father of faith, Abraham Avinu, but not the one on religious postcards. Not the old man with a white beard gazing at the stars. No. The Abraham of the Tanakh, the one from the Peshet, the one from the raw, uncomfortable, and luminous reading. This character seen from a historical perspective is something else. A migrant with a prophetic vocation. An intercessor who challenges God. A liberator who knows how to use the sword and also how to say no to power. A patriarch who places slaves under a covenant, but not before abolishing their slavery. It all begins in Ur of the Chaldeans, a city where, in Abraham's time, a reign of oppression, inequality, and people were burned alive unless they bowed before the king. In those years, Ur was like Nazi Germany, to give an example that better illustrates them. And upon leaving Ur of the Chaldeans, which is why the Torah names them, because they were evil people, Abraham continues through Haran and ends up in Canaan. But this isn't ancestral tourism. It's a foundational migration. Abraham doesn't emigrate because of hunger or war, but rather in search of justice. He leaves because he receives an order as ambiguous as it is powerful. Go, to the land I will show you. Who does that? Who leaves everything for something they've never even seen? Only someone who doesn't seek to belong, but to transform. And he transforms. As soon as he arrives, he begins his sermon. but not from the pulpits, from his tent, from his table, from his hospitality, with the souls they made in Haran. That strange phrase that speaks of people molded, formed, influenced. Not subjects, not spiritual clients, but ethical disciples who were once slaves and Abraham freed with his sword, bringing upon himself the hatred of the evil kings and rulers of his generation. Then comes the conflict with his nephew Lot. A local dispute, yes, but also a portrait of priorities. Lot chooses the greenest, most attractive lands. Abraham gives in. He doesn't fight for material possession. He knows that his promise depends not on the land, but on the path, because the true inheritance is not in acres, but in legacy. And then, war. For kings wreak havoc, taking captives, including his nephew Lot. Why? Well, I'll give you the context, because by freeing slaves and teaching monotheism, Abraham was breaking the oppressive chains of the kingdoms of the day. Abraham becomes the number one enemy of the wicked of his time. Then Abraham arms 318 men again, homeborn, and attacks. Result? A successful rescue. But here comes the ethical bombshell. The king of Sodom offers him the goods. Abraham responds, "I will not take a thread or a belt." He refuses the loot. Who does that today? Who wins a war and takes nothing? Only those who know that victory without ethics is defeat, and because they knew that the loot was filthy, stolen, illegitimate, and filled with the blood of innocents. Then comes an almost mystical encounter with Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, a place that is now Jerusalem, and Melchizedek blesses him. And with it, a scene that prefigures something greater, the pact between the pieces. Animals split in half, a divine presence passing between them, and a promise sealed in the darkness. Mystical? Yes, but also legal. Here Abraham doesn't sign a contract, he walks through it. He doesn't receive a clause, but a mission, righteousness imputed by faith. Not by ritual, not by merit, by active trust. But the story gets complicated. The covenant of circumcision arrives. Here everyone is incorporated, born in the house and bought with money. The elephant in the tent. Because yes, Abraham has servants. Yes, he buys them. And yes, he brings them into the pact. Does it humanize the servile structure? Perhaps. Does it abolish it? Not entirely, but progressively, because those laws that Abraham applied are the ones that Moses would write centuries later in the Torah. Because his slaves could be freed after 7 years in the land of Canaan, and it was optional. It's not today's class, but the freedom of slaves has a process for the economic benefit of both the owner and the slave. That's how it was in ancient times. Obviously, it's not like that today. And if that weren't enough, the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible gives us 2 tense episodes with powerful kings, Pharaoh in Egypt and Abimelech in Gerar. In both, Abraham lies out of fear. He presents Sarah as his sister. He protects her, yes, but at the cost of exposing her. Cowardly? Pragmatic? Humane? Perhaps all of these at once. Because even the patriarch has gray areas. He's not a superhero. He's a man confronted by power, trying to survive without losing himself against the kings he fights, perhaps without them directly knowing it, but Abraham defended a model different from the imperial slavery of his time. And that's why God loved him, because Abraham loved his neighbor as himself. And when you think you've seen it all, the Akida arrives. God asks him to sacrifice his son, and Abraham obeys, without question, without argument. There is no intercession here, no bargaining. Only silence and a knife. The same man who argued about Sodom now remains silent in the face of the most absurd command. A test of faith? A dangerous submission? A symbolic act? The Tanakh offers no explanations. It only shows a father raising his arm and an angel stopping him at the last second, because the God of the Bible abhors human sacrifice. Human sacrifices that, by the way, were practiced by the Canaanites who lived in the promised land in those years. What does all this leave us with? A legacy. Not of easy answers, but of tensions. Abraham is not a model of perfection. He is a model of searching, of walking when there is no map, of acting when no one else does, of challenging God out of love for one's neighbor, even when they are evil, because we must love our enemies, as Moses wrote centuries later, but Abraham also remains silent before God when the command is the Akida, a korban. The Abraham of the Tanakh is not comfortable, he is not tameable, but he is real. Because his story, like every honest founding story, is not a fairy tale. It is a brutal challenge to our own way of living faith, power, justice, and doubt. Abraham as a spiritual liberator, The classic rabbinic reading says the following about the verse that says, "The souls they made in Haran." Rashi on Genesis chapter 12.5 comments, "Abraham converted the men and Sarah the women." It is considered as if they had created them. The Midrash Genesis Rabbah 39:14 formulates the same idea, to draw under the wings of the Shekinah, the divine presence. This is the midrashic basis for presenting him as an emancipator from idolatry, because slavery begins in the spirit, but is first liberated by the body. Don't forget this, it is one of the codes of the Torah. Maimonides, Rambam, summarizes Abraham's intellectual biography. He discovers the Creator through reason or logic and teaches multitudes to abandon idolatry. This is written in Maimonides' work Hilchot Avodah Zarah 1:3. It is the halakhic philosophical formulation of Abrahamic spiritual liberation. Abraham and the Kings, persecution for his evangelical, liberating, monotheistic message, according to the Midrash, and power struggles, because Abraham became so rich that the kings around him began to fear him. There is the Midrash about King Nimrod and the fiery furnace. Midrashic tradition Genesis Rabbah 38, and later developments, narrates that Nimrod, a malevolent king, persecutes and throws Abraham into the furnace for tearing down idols and upholding monotheism. It is a political religious persecution against his work, liberating from idol worship. For some scholars, there is some analogy here with the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews during World War II. The Chaldeans would be the parallel to the Nazis, which is why Abraham has to flee Ur. In this context, Abraham emigrates both to save his life and that of his family, and goes in search of the land that I will show you, meaning a place where he can live in peace. There is also the famous War of the Four Kings. Kedorlaomer's campaign is economic imperial. Abraham intervenes to free captives, his nephew Lot and his people. The king of Sodom attempts to reimpose his rule over the people, and Abraham refuses to commodify them. Thematic reading, resistance to the reductionism of people to plunder, consistent with his ethic of civil and social liberty. Pharaoh and Abimelech. These episodes of tension over power and the integrity of Abraham's family, according to Flavius Josephus, the first-century Judeo-Roman historian, Abraham taught science and a theistic vision in Egypt, which made him an intellectually disruptive figure, a revolutionary, a monotheist among idolaters, a freak that imperial power must eradicate. That is Abraham's life, taking God's honor as his own and loving his neighbor as himself. As we have already said, physical freedom is essential as the normative precedent for the ransom of captives. Genesis 14 contains the first biblical account of war, and it focuses on ransom, de facto pidyon shavuim, the return of the women and the people. That is, the first war mentioned in the Torah is intended to free kidnapped people. If you don't know, and this is learned from the Parashah Mishpatim in the Torah of Moses, worse than murder, according to the Torah, is kidnapping. For this reason, in later Jewish exegesis, redeeming captives will be a mandate of the highest priority. Several commentators paradigmatically trace it back to the gesture of Abraham. According to a Hellenistic Jewish tradition, Abraham was a teacher who dismantled ideologies of power. Flavius Josephus rewrote Genesis for a Greco-Roman audience in the 1st century and presents Abraham as a teacher of astronomy and arithmetic in Egypt, capable of persuading multitudes. This image reinforces the role of an intellectual liberator who challenges political religious orders by offering a unitary worldview. Thus, according to what has been explained academically, and getting as close as possible to the historical Abraham, it is sustainable to affirm, with a strong textual basis, that Abraham acted as a physical liberator of captives and repudiated appropriating people as part of the spoils. It is equally defensible, in midrashic and philosophical terms, to present him as a spiritual liberator who emancipates from idolatry, creates souls, and forms disciples of monotheism, according to the great rabbis of history such as Rashi, the Midrash Genesis Rabbah, and Rambam Maimonides. This is a well-attested classical Jewish interpretation. Now, let's give this class a historical context, understanding the impact that Abraham's legacy has had on universal history in Judeo-Christian culture or civilization. In 1st century proto-Christianity, the Pauline proclamation converting Gentiles into children of Abraham served as a struggle against Roman slavery and explains the clash with Rome and the martyrdom of the first Christians, who were initially simply Jewish believers in the messiahship of Yeshua, specifically speaking of the early years of the proto-Christian gospel. With biblical and extra-biblical sources, Evidence supports the radical theological equalization, children/heirs of Abraham by faith, that de-hierarchizes statuses, Jewish/Greek, slave/free, male/female. This is clear in the communities of the Apostle Paul, or Rabbi Saul of Tarsus, as he was originally known. Although Saul of Tarsus doesn't have a legal abolitionist program against Roman slavery, at least not in the official history, which, by the way, was written by the Romans themselves, what fidelity is there in this? I think it's very little. But there are specific pastoral/many mystery impulses, as in the first epistle of Corinthians chapter 7 from verse 21 onwards it says, "Were you called while a slave? Let it not concern you. But also, if you can become free, strive for it all the more. For he who is called while a slave in the Lord is the Lord's freedman, so he who is called while free is the Messiah's slave. You are bought with a price. Do not be slaves of men. Each one, brothers, in the same state in which he was called, so remain with God." Also, in the epistle to Philemon, there is a reconfiguration of kinship, brothers, body, with the potential to subvert the Roman domestic order. Because you must understand that many Gentiles in the first century who lived in cities under Roman authority such as Galatians, Corinth, Thessalonica, among others, basically all of these were under Roman imperial rule. Many of the Gentiles were slaves, something that did not happen with the Jews, because the Jewish communities themselves were responsible for liberating their own Jewish brothers by buying them, but the Gentiles had no community to help them. Although they don't tell you this, because I repeat, the official history is Roman Catholic, which has dominated discourse and narrative for almost 2 millennia. The main reason for the conflict between the early Christians, who are the proto-Christians or primitive Christianity, as other authors call it, the main problem between the proto-Christians and Rome was religious and political. Rejection of the imperial cult because the emperor believed himself to be a god, son of the sun, and suspicion of religious associations that were subversive to imperial discourse. However, official history won't tell you that there was a Christian anti-slavery campaign. But this is the truth hidden in history that they don't want you to see, because in the end, the Gentiles were being called to be children of Abraham by faith, not by blood, as Abraham, as we have seen in this class, did, liberating their neighbors, even their enemies if possible. You should know that in the Roman context of the first century, even before and after, slavery was structural, the economic and domestic basis. The law regulates manumissions, manumissio, and limits mass liberations. According to Roman sources, such as the Lex Fufia Caninia and the Lex Aelia Cintia. There are other classical sources such as Gaius, Institutes I, the procedure and limits of manumission/citizenship. Seneca, episode 47, ethical criticism of abuses, but not of the Roman slave system. And Epictetus, internal freedom of the slave, not dismantling of the regime. What I mean by this is that the Romans could criticize abuses, but they never criticized the system, because the Roman imperial system was racist, although they don't want to tell you that either, but it's the harsh historical truth. Democracy existed only for Romans, children of Romans, but not for the other races they considered inferior, including the Jewish race. That's how Rome thought. There are multiple sources where Saul of Tarsus, the apostle to the Gentiles, calls his Gentile converts from idolatry to be children of Abraham through faith. The Epistle of Galatians is filled with expressions such as, through faith, Gentiles are descendants of Abraham and heirs, and also, there is neither slave nor free, all one. You are no longer a slave, but a son. Romans 4 says, Abraham is the father of believers, circumcised or not. But is there a monomissionary impulse? Key texts such as 1 Corinthians 7 verses 21 to 23 express that if you can become free, take advantage of it. You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. It indicates a preference for freedom when feasible, without widespread political upheaval, but this text says that you are bought with a price, as if referring to the fact that this community freed Gentile slaves by paying, as Jewish communities did with Jews. This is historical evidence that at least the Corinthian community of believers literally paid to free a fellow slave. This is precisely what the Torah of Moses mandates, and as Abraham did in his time. In Philemon 15-17, we have further evidence of this from Onesimus, where Paul asks Philemon to accept him no longer as a slave, but as a beloved brother. It suggests manumission, or at least, a redefinition of the bond. Most scholars understand that Onesimus was a slave, although there are minority alternative hypotheses to this. Some scholarly assessments confirm that Paul does not articulate legal abolitionism, because in fact it is prohibited by the Torah. Remember that the liberation of slaves in the Torah of Moses is a process according to the laws of Shemitah and Yobel, and depends on whether one is in the land of Israel or in the diaspora. Saul of Tarsus is basically applying and interpreting the Torah of Moses to the Gentiles. For me, and for some scholars, Paul does promote a communal ethic that undermines objectification, which is the act of treating people as objects. The Torah strongly prohibits this because it tells Israel to love the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt. But was the liberation of slaves with the gospel to the Gentiles the main problem with Rome? Not necessarily, because there is also a spiritual problem or background here. Extra-biblical evidence places the conflict on a different axis, for example. Pliny to Trajan, approximately 110 CE in his epistle 10:96-97, says that Rome prosecuted Christians by name and for refusing to sacrifice to the gods. He describes meetings, hymns, and moral oaths. He does not necessarily mention an anti-slavery agenda. Tacitus, Annals 1544, in 64 CE, 6 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, mentions a persecution by Nero after the fire, rumors of harmful superstition, but nothing about abolishing slavery. One of the accusations leveled against early Christians in the 1st century by the Romans was suspicious associations. Collegia, the Roman state, was suspicious of private brotherhoods. Pliny even prohibited fire brigades for fear of riots. X.33-34. Christianity was interpreted as an illicit college and as civic impiety for rejecting the imperial cult, which was basically idolatry by imposing that the emperor was the son of the sun, that is, a god. I recall then that Abraham also fought against the idolatry of his time because, ultimately, slavery is related to idolatry. The historical conclusion is that the clash with Rome is explained by religious loyalty and public order, imperial cult/collegia, but not by a direct confrontation with the slave system. The reason is that the Torah itself and Judaism of the time did not eliminate slavery directly or radically, but they did so progressively. If you're watching the free Mishnah course we offer on this YouTube channel, you'll have seen the class on the Tavi slave, the most famous slave in the Mishnah, where we explain in more detail the laws of slave liberation in the Torah of Moses and the Second Temple period. If you haven't seen it, you can see it in our list of videos published in Tractate Parashah, chapter 2.7. So, spiritual liberation, meaning children by adoption, it deactivates the ideology that legitimizes absolute domination, slaves by nature, that is, by race. The Torah is not racist, although some radicals interpret it that way, but it isn't. The Torah teaches equality in inheritance and re-educates masters and servants in a system that, while permitting slavery, minimizes it. The Torah promotes gradual social liberation, preference for manumission when possible, fraternal pressure to reconfigure relationships. It's not state abolitionism, but rather a moral community lever that contributes to liberation, and this is what was experienced in the early Gentile communities during Paul's ministry. Here's a clear verdict. Yes, Paul converts Gentiles into children of Abraham and establishes hereditary equality that theologically delegitimizes slavery as a human identity. This liberates on the spiritual ecclesial level and leads to freedom when it is achievable. But no, there is no evidence that Pauline proto-Christianity led a political crusade against slavery, or that this was the main problem with Rome. The clash was over imperial worship, impiety, and associationism. That's it for today's class. Until the next video. Shalom.